Shalom, everyone. Welcome to another Spotlight series. We are so blessed to be here with all of you here in person. It is the first time we're doing this in person again, so that is very exciting. And welcome to all of our friends who are watching from near and far digitally. We are so excited that you could join us. Tonight, we welcome a very special guest who's really no stranger to our community at all, which is so exciting. Daniel Levin, who is an associate professor of photography at TWA, a documentary and conceptual art photographer, filmmaker, and author, and perhaps most importantly, our congregant.
Yes.
So thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to learn not just about your work, although we're excited to learn about your work, but we want to learn a little bit about the person behind the lens and where your inspiration comes from, hopefully so we can walk away with our own inspiration today. So I'd love to start hearing a little bit about you and your upbringing and where you're from and what brought you here to this moment.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Dadun and Tifereth, and everyone that came today face-to-face and virtually. Thank you for asking me. It's humbling to, it's kind of like this is your life. I'm not used to that. Who was the host of that show? I don't know. It was good, though. So I'm a native Ohioan. I grew up in Akron. My parents were born in Akron. I did my undergrad in Rochester, New York, in documentary photography, and worked for some photographers in Rochester afterwards, and then moved to Chicago and worked for others. And anyhow, I'll tell you more about that later. But I have 3 daughters, one of whom is here tonight, and then a half-daughter that's here as well. She's not really a half, but Claire Levin and Lily Wah, who's my stepdaughter, I guess, and Allison and Claire. They all work at nonprofits. Their mothers were divorced, but their mother's the director of Heights Library System. So she's at a nonprofit, I guess. Well, maybe that isn't considered to be that. And I work at TWA, so I too am kind of working in a similar capacity.
You have so much to be proud of.
I do. I'm very proud of them all, and their every father's dream is to have them be self-sufficient financially, and it looks like we're there.
Well done.
So,
well done. Mazel tov.
Yeah.
Gainfully employed. Mazel tov.
And paying the rent.
Yes, amen to that.
Yes. Yeah. So yes.
So can I ask you? I want to ask you about a memory for a moment. Do you remember the first photograph or picture that you saw that moved you, perhaps so much that you said, "That's what I want to do"?
I do. But what I think I'd like to share with you is not necessarily the first photograph that I made that made me think this is going to be my career. But instead, I was a lost soul, high school kid, early high school, lived in Akron, went to Copley High School, not many Jews there as there is today. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know what college to go to, what to study, urban, rural, suburban, big, small. And so my parents, without me asking, I think they realized my lostness. And they brought me to the big city. They brought me to Cleveland, to John Carroll, to meet, I believe his name is John Nozzle, director of counseling. He had a PhD in counseling. And after spending a day taking all kinds of aptitude and dexterity tests with him, and he took me to a lunch, the institution, my life changed. He took me to Geraci's for lunch.
Wow.
It was my first time. Notice I haven't forgotten. But at the end of the day, and he was not very tall of a man. I remember he wrote his results backwards, upside down, I should say. I was across the table from him. It was crazy. I was like in awe. I can't even describe it. But he wrote it for me across the table. And when my parents were invited in at the end of the day, he suggested to them, maybe you want to get him a camera. So I was a skeptical kid, but I thought, okay. But that's really, I mean, I can't explain it.
Did that resonate with you at the time? Did you say, oh yeah, I could see myself falling in love with...
I wasn't thinking, oh, he's nuts, but at the same time, it didn't move me necessarily. As a boy, my aunt, Carol, who lives in Aurora today, took me to, I spoke in Tampa. I flew back last night, and I went to St. Pete the night before for dinner. And she took me to Beechwood. Again, I'm an Akronite. She took me to Beechwood to see the Dali Museum in Beechwood, Ohio, the largest collection of Dalis in the country. Now, the museum later, the director actually passed when the owner of that collection in Beechwood wanted to gift it to the Cleveland Museum of Art. The entire museum went to St. Petersburg, to what is now the Dali Museum. Mm-hmm. But there's no doubt that really moved me. I mean, I had never been exposed to art before.
Did it move you? Was that a pun? Because Dali art is very
yes,
slippery and slidey.
It is.
It moved you figuratively and literally.
Yes. And there was one other situation long before I was a photographer that was really impactful for me. My uncle David, who's my godmother, my dad's sister's husband, had a cousin, first cousin in New York. Uncle David was a New Yorker, and his cousin was Peter B. Kaplan. And Peter was afraid of heights, but he ended up being forced in the military. His card came up, and he, believe it or not, he became a paratrooper. And so he worked through his fears. And eventually, he specialized in heights as a photographer, an editorial photographer. And so when Carter was president, the Iran hostage crisis was going on. My Uncle David asked me if I wanted to go with him. I was probably in junior high, to Hermitage, Pennsylvania, to meet Peter. I wasn't a photographer at the time, but it was incredible. Peter was up on this cherry picker at Hermitage at the cemetery. Every day the hostages were imprisoned. They hung a new flag all over the cemetery. And this was for Life magazine. It was like the mecca of magazines. Mm. And then Peter sent me up, and I'm afraid of heights. He sent me up by myself. And anyhow, that was, I couldn't believe he made a living making photographs.
That's definitely memorable.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears just a tiny bit because I want to talk a little bit more about your youth, because in our conversations together, you spoke to me a little bit about your Jewish upbringing and your youth group work and the role of social justice, mm-hmm. and how that in some ways has also led to your love for photography. Can you tell us a little bit more about your upbringing and how that inspired you? Well,
definitely. I don't think anything inspired me more in my life than my involvement in the Northeast Lakes Federation of Temple Youth, NELFT, the Reform Movement. And before this evening, the youth group was outside and we lit candles together. And I love that because it really reminds me of my youth. Since there weren't many Jews at my high school, when I got involved in NELFT as an Akronite, it really opened up my mind to, first of all, being around other Jewish people, but being around Reform Jewish kids. And eventually I became the newspaper editor, and the region went from Canton and Akron, Ohio, to Montreal and Ottawa. And we'd go on these incredible weekends to visit others. And it was just filled with ruach, filled with spirit. So that was probably my first time getting involved in journalism. But mostly I need to respond to your question by talking about the Reform Movement's commitment to social justice, because it is who I am, and it was entirely formed during those years. My friend Martin's here, and I know he had a similar experience, although we didn't know each other. But it absolutely formed me. And, I went on to college afterwards, and I wasn't doing social justice. I wasn't involved. I was studying, and honestly, it was years later, although I was a documentary photographer, so that's all about social justice. But it was years later, living in Cleveland, that I started doing some work again related to society, and including in the Jewish society, but not specifically to that only. And that's when I was unaffiliated, because after the girls got to a certain age, we weren't affiliated. They grew up at Park, in conservative Park Synagogue. And I was unaffiliated for a long time. And I came to Tifereth, and I'd heard about the arts programming from many friends. And it just blew my mind that I refound myself. Because I feel, and this is just me, but I feel that the Reform movement is uniquely involved in social justice of the Jewish denominations. And when I say social justice, I mean including, but beyond the Jewish community. And I know why I'm so attracted to that. It's because of my youth. It's who I am. And so I'm so happy to be here, and my projects, I've been very, very involved in the last few years in a number of projects, but it all stems from my youth. I'm deeply grateful for it. And honestly, I mean, this is just me talking, but I don't understand, because to me, Judaism is all about kindness and social justice. And not all denominations of Judaism support those issues in the greater world the way this synagogue does and the way I do. And it confounds me, because to me, social justice is my Jewishness. So anyhow, I can't worry about others. I'm just grateful to be here and doing this work.
Thank you for sharing that. I think you touch on something that is really important, in that there are so many aspects and points of entry into Reform Judaism. You're certainly right that social justice is definitely one of them. But there are so many points of interest and so many points of connection, and really making that connectedness that's personal, but also throughout the whole community. And I mean, social justice is certainly a very important element. Yeah. So with your kind of childhood inspiration, I want to shift gears just a little bit, and I'd love to learn where you get your inspiration from today, and kind of lead us into the conversation about your work with Violins and Hope. And in particular, I'm very curious about the hope part of this project.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just gonna wait a minute about violins, just to share with you, because I was thinking about this, this night, and what helped me become who I am. And I really attribute that certainly to my parents. My mom was the manager of the Ronald McDonald House in Akron before it was built. And so for years she was, including after it was built. It was during the fundraising period and everything. There was a lot involved, and usually it's a paid position. She would never accept it. And my grandfather her dad was deeply involved in community. He was born in 1900. He was a jeweler. Actually have some images I'd like to share. That Jew boy in the middle is my papa, Al, the one with the big ears, right in the middle. And this is outside of Pittsburgh, I think in McKees Rocks or Glassport. Wow. And his dad died at a young age, and he was actually in an institution. I'm not exactly sure why, but I found that out being interested in genealogy. I'm trying to find out why, but I haven't been able to. But he actually lived in Pittsburgh for a year with his grandparents, so he could go say Kaddish every Friday. But he lived there throughout the whole year, not just on Fridays. Yeah. I got a chance to go to Pittsburgh for Thanksgiving one year, and I found the building where my great-grandmother's shop was, men's clothing and all kinds of things. It was not fancy. It's a little town. And I found all kinds of articles since. Every day and more gets posted on the web. It's a goldmine for a genealogist to just continue looking. But when I went in, the back door was open of this abandoned building. And this is the ceiling. And there's Stars of David. It's possible. It's just decorative. But it's also possible it was chosen by her because it's the Star of David. My hands were shaking, so it's a little blurry. And then on my mom's side, the maternal line, my mom's dad was Bernard Pitchell. And Bernard was an Austrian, very poor man, a cigar maker. And he moved to Pittsburgh and then later Cincinnati. This is Bernard. And he fought in the Civil War. And I found this Word document was at my great aunt's. And it was only late after I had seen it over and over and over again and not cared to read it. One day I read it and I was like, what? It actually, here's a detail, talks about each battle he was in. It's quite large. But and maybe it's a romantic mindset that I have, that Bernard joined the Union to try to make the nation a free nation for all. I don't know if he was that idealistic, but I'd like to think so. So that impacts me. I actually found, and his name is in this book, the Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. I can't read it upside down. Something of the rebellion, but that's his name. But they called him Pickle instead of Bernard Pitchell. And I found his flag. I belong to on Facebook a regiment that descendants of this regiment, and they were all Germans. They spoke German in the field. And I'm sure he was the only Jew. And anyhow, no one knew that the flag still existed. And so here it is. It's quite large. This is the flag that was held in each battle in front of everybody. It's quite large. It's just a mess. But it's kept in the state capital of Pennsylvania. The 87th Regiment. And this is actually a branch. Not the real stick must have broken, and anyhow. And then this is his grandson. His grandson or his son, Irving Pitchell. So Irving was one of the Hollywood 18. McCarthy named him as a communist. And I found this picture today. This is on the set of a film he made that won an Academy Award for science fiction called Destination Moon. And he discovered Natalie Wood. But what I want to get to here is that his life was ruined because of his Jewishness. So many of those who were in the Hollywood 10 or the Hollywood 18 were Jewish. Here he was directing Fred McMurray and Frank Sinatra, and Mickey Rooney and Orson Welles. That's him in the middle, right behind the guy with glasses in the middle. And this is in Washington. Lauren Bacall and Bogart flew in, and all these others, Danny Kaye, to try to speak up for those who were blacklisted by McCarthy. And then finally, I just want to mention something I just discovered. Unbelievable. So maybe you've seen this film, some of you, The Janes. Just a couple months ago, I was watching this documentary, I think on Netflix, and it was after the decision that struck down Roe v. Wade by Alito. And it was about these women in the 60s who lived in Chicago, most of them graduates of University of Chicago, and many of them Jewish, and they were, they were badasses. They illegally, before Roe v. Wade, when it was illegal to have abortions, they would quietly, publicly make make it known in Chicago that if you need an abortion, come to us. And someone's home phone would ring, and people would ask for Jane, and then they would go to a destination, apartment or storefront, and then they would drive as if the police are following them. And I really recommend this film. Then they'd go to another destination and another one, and their abortions would be, And eventually the mafia tried to get the doctor to give payola, and he trained the women to perform the abortions. So my point is this: I'm watching this, and sometimes the audio changes before the video when you're watching a movie, and I recognize this voice. It's my cousin Katie. My mom's first cousin, or second cousin, Katie Frankel, on the other side of the family. And she was a Jane. She lives in Chicago. Her daughter's a rabbi in Philly. And I called her up that night, and I was like, Katie. Her face filled the frame as she's talking to the camera. And I asked her if she was frightened, and she said it was terrifying. And yeah, all I can say is she was speaking up for those that, and that's amazing. And I'd like to try to follow it in this path.
I would certainly say that's inspiring, especially in your work. So tell us a little bit about your work, and perhaps with violins, or I think we'll save some of the new stuff for a few minutes from now. But and I have of course, a copy of the violin's book.
Yeah. So just before I went to Vermont to get my MFA in visual art, I studied documentary, as I said, and for 16 years, when I lived in Cleveland, I would mostly go to Hopkins to fly to wherever I was going to. When I was commissioned to make environmental portraits. This is an example. It's a portrait I made of Barbara Bush. But I photographed a lot of people like that. And this is, I am Pei and Jan Wenner. I'm going with my girls and with Lily to Paris this summer, we just found out. And he's the one that designed the glass pyramid at the Louvre, as well as our rock hall here. Wenner is the founder of Rolling Stone. At any rate, I spent many years doing this. And when my predecessor told me she was thinking about retiring from Tri-C, she was the founder of the photo program at Tri-C, she asked me if I would consider applying. And there was a national search, but I was chosen. And that's been an amazing journey. I don't think I have any, I have some other personal work here. But yeah, so maybe teaching, and then we'll get to this.
I would actually, I want to just ask you a couple of questions about the process for a moment. And, so we have had the privilege of having your work here at our temple and hearing you speak about this project. But I actually want to hear a little bit about your experience in hearing people's responses to this work. And maybe just share what is something that surprised you? Were you surprised at anybody's reactions or responses? What challenged you? Where did something kind of unexpected happen while working on this project?
So for those people that don't know what it is, I documented Amnon Weinstein, a second-generation luthier in Tel Aviv, a luthier is a string instrument maker, usually of acoustic instruments. His father was the luthier of Tel Aviv just prior to the war. And he lost his entire family, everybody, parents, grandparents, cousins, everybody. And he was the luthier and mentor to Shlomo Mintz and Yitzhak Perlman and other kids in Tel Aviv. Amnon is now 85-ish years old. He may be tuned in tonight, I don't know, except he should be sleeping. Go to bed. Amnon had this epiphany to take these violins that somehow miraculously survived the Holocaust, even though they only weigh a half pound, and without the strings and fingerboards and so on. The violins brought hope, not only to those who played them, that they could live another hour, day, whatever. They could be shot at any time, whether in the ghetto or the camps. And also hope to people who could hear the music, whose life was not even, you couldn't describe it. And they could escape into their mind. These violins were stigmatized, and they, after the war, and nobody would play them, not even the owners that did survive. And so over time, they were brought to Moshe, and then eventually Amnon. And I should mention that Amnon's son, Avshi, is the third-generation luthier who lives in Istanbul, married a Muslim Turkish woman. They have 2 kids there. He has a luthier studio there. So there are 3 generations. But Amnon had this realization that, or this epiphany, if you will, that if I restore these violins to their ultimate playability, even if it's breaking all the rules of a curator who would never allow someone to do anything more than cleaning and displaying an object that goes in a museum, but to restore them to their ultimate playability. And he's a master who studied under 3 of the great luthiers of Cremona, Italy. That it would be a palatable way, frankly, a beautiful way to experience the story of the Holocaust. And who would play them? Not only some of the world's greatest violinists, many of them, but a lot of children all over the world in performances. And it's incredible. To answer your question, Yael, it's hard to put my finger on it, but people have been very emotional. I mean, I just came back from Tampa last night. I spoke on Sunday at Tampa. And, someone came up to me who was in tears, and she didn't even have a direct connection. Her family was, and I should mention that my dad's grandfather was Victor Levin, which really was Poteshnikov, and his dad Israel came from the Pale of Settlement, and one whole side of Israel's family was killed, and including his cousin who was a rabbi. But it is hard for me to put my finger on it, but I'm like, I will never say I expect emotional responses, but it's been incredible. I really am sorry, my phone just rang. There are people who tell me they have a violin. They start to tell me the story. I've made some introductions with them and Amnon or Avshi. And I'm humbled to say that my exhibition, which the book had its national release in a place called the Temple-Tifereth, Israel, and the exhibition had its in its new form, had its national debut here as well. And the exhibition has been picked up, and it's en route right now to New York City, where it's going to be shown the end of July, all of February, all of March at Temple Emmanuel, which I humbly, jokingly, I should say, call the Cathedral of the Jews.
Yeah, there's something to that.
Because we don't have cathedrals, but if there is one, it's there.
That's what it is.
Yeah. But there have been beautiful, beautiful responses. And even though I'm only telling Amnon's story, it's not the actual violins. People are deeply moved. And I should say that the violins have never been to New York City, and they're going to be with my exhibition during that time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I look forward to hearing about that.
Thanks.
So tell us a little bit about what you're working on now.
So now I'm going to skip ahead. This is some past work. I'm just going to skip ahead. Sorry if you're looking up my nose.
Wow.
Okay, so my violins I shot over 4 days in Tel Aviv, and I ended up editing all these pictures down to 72 for the book. And that's a lot. I would never want to have an exhibition that's 72. I never knew I was going to do a book. And
And it took 14 months to prepare the book.
and 14 months to write it. on my front porch in the first year of COVID. It did win the Independent Publishers National Book of the Year Award for History this year.
Well,
and
that's
was also, thank you, it was also nominated for the Forward Indies National Book Award, specifically for photography. It was a finalist, I should say. And the Jewish Book Awards are next month in New York, so I'm hopeful maybe there'll be some recognition there.
We're rooting for you.
Thank you, thank you. But so while there are 72 pictures, and it took me 4 days to shoot it, I've been working on a project for 3.5 years during all this time. And I have 8 pictures completed. I have 2 more pictures to do. I'm giving myself a year to do that. And it has to do with, it comes from the same place as Violins of Hope, which is about kindness and making sure we treat the other as the other. I'd also like to go back a step and mention that our Franz Welser Most, who is our music director of the Cleveland Orchestra, which the New York Times regularly calls the Cleveland as a pet name, and said as recently as last year, the Cleveland once again is America's finest. Its music director, Franz Welser Most, was born in Austria, and he was kind enough to write the foreword for my book. And he was uniquely suited to do that. Why? Because I could have reached out to anyone. In fact, Joshua Bell wrote a testimonial for it. I did a portrait of Joshua Bell that's in the book. But I could have reached out to anyone. But why is he so well suited? Because not only is he a scholar of music, and he happens to be our scholar of the Cleveland Orchestra, but he was born in Austria, and his dad fought for the Nazis, and he goes there in his foreword. It's a long foreword, and it's beautiful. And his premise of it all matches by chance. I didn't tell him what to write. It's, please don't treat the other as the other. And you can imagine how he's uniquely suited to say this. My project that I just started to share with you, that I'm doing now, is called Kindness Repeated. And I've never shown it. I've shown it to one group at the Maltz, maybe one picture, a couple of years ago. But I'm going to share a couple with you now, and I'm kind of excited about that. This is the idea. I'll try to make it brief. I made a list of 10 different oppressions that I feel are happening in America today by some elected officials on their own populations. This is just me. I tell my students, it's not your professor doing this, it's Daniel Levin. I'm just an artist. I'm just a guy. But I'm a guy who doesn't really march, but this is my way of speaking out. And it couldn't be more different than this Violins of Hope book, which is documentary. It falls squarely into contemporary art. In fact, it's performance-based, and I'm not a performer. But in graduate school, I was exposed to performance art. It's basically a still of a performance, which I would call a tableau. And so 10 different oppressions. What kind of oppressions? Voter suppression, forced separation of children from parents, the denial of science, the vilification of journalism, cronyism. One I haven't done yet is book burning, and the list goes on, but I'm keeping it to 10. And so I met with scholars, and I found 10 people in history, and each one was elected as well and had oppressed their own population back in the day somewhere in the world in the exact same way that one of these oppressions is happening now, from my point of view. And then I went to LA and I got wardrobe from 2 of the largest houses of where wardrobes go when they finish a film. And these collections started back in the silent picture days, and they're still being growing in these 2 houses. And if I can't find the exact clothing that matches a painting or a photograph I have found, I have them made by a master designer who happens to have been my student, an African-American grandfather fashion designer who lives in Cleveland. And he's incredibly talented. And so finally I'll share with you that I become the historical figure, and then I go somewhere in America where I feel the oppression is happening today. And so it bends time. Obviously, the premise is that history matters. And if one doesn't care to know history, history will repeat itself. But you won't hear me say that in the gallery or on the wall. You won't hear me preach. The art isn't preachy. It's just, I think, really kind of very, very beautiful. And they're going to be very big, maybe as big as 8 feet.
Do you envision hanging these? I mean, these are, as we'll see in a moment, these are very strong pieces. Do you envision putting them all kind of in one space all together? Mm-hmm. And a kind of a secondary, a follow-up to that, it is going to be interesting, and if you could say maybe a few words as to why you are the person in every picture, mm-hmm. and what is that going to kind of look like in a space altogether?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, Yael, because it had to be me. It would be very easy to say, oh, it had to be me because I'm always there, I don't have to hire someone. But I'm the one that's making the statement. I'm the one that feels this way. And I can't imagine hiring someone to stand in for that and kind of perform my feelings. Mm. But at the same time, it's not me at all. It's my face. Mm-hmm. It's my project. But I'm the historical figure who did it. And I am the current figure who I feel is doing it today. And so it's kind of 3 people, if you will. So let me share a few. So this one is a painting of Pope Urban VIII. And Pope Urban VIII told our Galileo, denounce your theories or you'll be excommunicated and burned at the stake. The theories were Copernican theories, that the earth revolves around the sun. He denounced them, but he knew they were true. But the Galileo was forced to have house arrest the rest of his life. That's the denial of science. In 1990, the current pope made a decree that, yes, the earth does revolve around the sun. And not only does he not need to be forgiven, but he didn't do anything wrong. 350 years later, that was announced. And I remember that. That was long before I was thinking about this project. So what was my context going to be when I dressed like Pope Urban? I decided to choose climate change, but I could have chosen other denials of the science that I feel are happening today. And I feel this is unkind. And that's why this project is called Kindness Repeated. I want people to leave the gallery without anything in the gallery telling them this is bad. And I want them to leave and think, where was the kindness? That's the idea. So I chose to go to Glacier because even Forbes magazine, which is conservative, wrote that by 2040, Glacier National Park will have no glaciers. When I flew out there to do the shoot, which was later in the week after I had pneumonia at university hospitals for 3 days, my grant was going to run out, so I had to go before the end of the month. The locals told me, no, that's not true. 2030, 10 years earlier. So that's Pope Urban VIII. Notice what he's wearing, the shoes, the vestments. And that's the finished picture. One of my tenets is I will not drop myself in using Photoshop. I need to be there. And so I light it. I have a crew. And this is Avalanche Lake, and it used to be Avalanche Glacier. The only thing left, if you look behind me, are these waterfalls. There's a little bit of Avalanche Glacier left up in the mountains there. Also, I thought I'd share this with you. It's kind of fun. Oh, notice what I'm holding, the snow cone. So sometimes I use a little satire, not because I think it's funny, but because it's just unbelievable that this oppression is happening, this lack of care of the other, of our children, of our grandchildren who are going to have to live on this earth. And so I'm holding an ice, what's it called?
Snow cone.
Snow cone, thank you. I did have brain surgery, so snow cone. And Nancy Schwartzkatz, who has much art here, I called her up and I said, Nancy, can you paint snowflakes on a cone for me? I went to Michael's, I bought it, I carried it on the airplane. But the idea is that I control science as the Pope who controls science, and I can use that snow in whatever way I want until it's gone. This is a vestment I had made by Michael Wilson. I couldn't find the top vestment to fit me. My shoulders were too broad from what I found in Hollywood. So he made this beautiful vestment. And this is Michael with the fabric that was flown in from New York. Here I'm meeting with pilots from, I think they're called C5, the big cargo Air Force plane. They were there training, and they wanted to know what I was doing. And yeah, there's a good chance they were conservative, and they were deeply wonderful. And they understood when I explained. And now I want to show you something. I don't know how to do this.
Oh, wow. That looks like a lot of kindness to me.
So what happened? They asked me, well, that's so cool. Would you take a picture of us? And I was like, sure, but you have to get on my rock. And I was really happy because my another daughter, Allie, came with me. She's a filmmaker, and she was one of my crew. I had someone else. And we couldn't shoot the day before. There was a problem, and we lugged everything up there. And anyhow, and it was terribly cloudy all day, and at the very last minute, the sun broke, and I got this light. And so I said, you have to come on my rock. And they were so great. And I made a picture with the high-end camera, sent it to them, and they framed it, and hung it in their wardroom, which is their mess hall. Wow. And then they sent me a T-shirt and a patch from the pilot. Yeah. So it was so beautiful.
What a beautiful way to make a connection. Unexpected, too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So this is a second one. Should I jump to it or just wait?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more, and I want to open it up to questions, but I definitely want to see another one.
I'm going to show you two, but I'm not going to tell you the story. All I'll tell you is this is about voter suppression, and this is Elbridge Gerry, who was the governor of Mass from 1812 to 1814. And gerrymandering was created for him, even though his name's Gary. And that's me in the bastion of voter suppression in America, the state capitol building of Georgia, dressed as Elbridge Gerry. That wardrobe was used in Gods and Generals. I saw a patch inside. And I'm holding a quill, which with this little quill, I'm going to help all my friends with map making, and pardon me, but screw all my enemies. And it's happening still today, of course, especially here in Ohio and in Georgia. And then here's another one, Joanne Lai. And I'm just going to show you this. I'm having my eyebrows made with yak hair. I have no eyebrows. Trust me. And then finally, I have to show you this one because it's Jewish. And so this one is vilification of journalism, which I take very personally. The only paper I've ever shot for is the New York Times. And the paper of record, if you will. From my point of view, it is the paper of record. And journalism is so important. And I'm not going to use an umbrella term, media, and I'm not going to blast it all because we cannot. And even my liberal friends, and I'm mostly liberal, sometimes they'll say, I don't believe any of it anymore. And when I hear that, I find it very upsetting because, as we all know, journalism is known as the fourth estate. It is a weight that is a counter to, in balancing, to corruption in government and elsewhere. We need journalism. No democracy can exist without it. So Goebbels, the propaganda minister of Hitler, had a mantra. I did my Nazi project, but I had to do this because he was the perfect person for vilification of journalism. He had a mantra that he would yell at the podium. There he was with Hitler. Here he is at the podium. And he would yell, Lügenpresse, Lügenpresse, all the time. The translation is lying press. I can give it another word, 2 words, fake news. The exact same thing, which is the premise of my entire project. Each one of these things happened before. And so I had to be a Nazi in a news station, but what news station was going to let me in? Nobody. And I know that, and I'm kind of grateful they won't let me in as a Nazi, but I didn't know how to solve it. And yet I wouldn't drop myself in using Photoshop. So I realized, doing a lot of work in New York, that the second floor of the New York Times building is the masthead of the paper. And all I had to do was be a Nazi on 8th Avenue. And so here's the picture. The police came, and I kind of pushed them away. I had a crew of like 6 people. I kind of ignored them, and then they came back, but I got my picture. And here's a detail. You can see it says Lugenpresse. Some of you may know Zygote Press in Cleveland, a wonderful art print shop. And I bought the Nazi font, rezzed it up, gave it to an artist, and she silk screened it on the New York Times, and I shipped it to New York. So that's it.
And you have the sign behind you, the wrong way and the stop sign.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, especially being in a synagogue, it's obviously a very abrasive kind of picture, but there's no better way to say
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. We can't wait to hear more about it and be part of it, and this is so exciting to learn about. I'd like to pause for a moment and we have a microphone here in the middle if anyone wants to stand up and ask a question. If not, I am going to turn it. Okay, if anybody has any questions online, please send them in. In the meantime, I will ask one more question unless somebody wants to jump in. So much of your art helps us examine our world a little bit more carefully. And what would you say at this time that we need to be perhaps most conscious of? How do we kind of put a different lens on our cameras, if you will, our figurative cameras, and looking at the world in a different way and raising awareness?
Well, that's a hard question because, again, I don't believe in preaching. And hopefully none of my work does that. There's nothing wrong with preaching, but I don't know if people listen to it. So I can tell you, just as a professor, that I encourage my students to have a voice in what they care about. It is such a gift to be at Tri-C, specifically a community college, because I have students, many of you maybe have taken classes at Tri-C. One of my wonderful students, Jackie, is here. And so you never know who's going to be next to you. So it's kind of a microcosm of Cleveland or of our world. It could be a high school kid from the inner city. They could be from the suburbs. It could be someone retired off of the line at Ford. It could be a city prosecutor next to a stay-at-home mom, next to an inner city adult, and on and on and on, a retiree. And everyone dives into these projects in our 4-hour and 10-minute critiques, where they have chosen the project based on their interests, but following my parameters as well. And it is the most beautiful thing. And I just would use that as an example for anyone, no matter the art that they're interested, whether it be writing or illustration or theater or dance, to don't be afraid to use your voice, to genuinely be who you are, hopefully without preaching, and just celebrate, even if it's heavy, what is important to you. And I know that others will be interested.
Is there a particular audience, especially as relating to this project? I think it's safe to say that it's very bold. Is there a particular audience that you would like to see that really kind of uncovers and is moved by this art? Is there a particular demographic you think this needs to reach out to in particular?
No. No, but I have personal goals, like anyone, and my MFA was in visual art, conceptual art, nothing literal like a documentary project. So this project for me is a huge departure from where I have been, and it just so happens that some of the things I was exposed to kind of got mixed up in the bouillabaisse of my ideas, and I did have brain surgery. I know I mentioned that, but I totally lost my train of thought. So I don't know what, can you repeat your question?
That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you about. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Now I feel badly, I didn't answer the question, but.
That's okay.
So I have essential tremors, which is what Katharine Hepburn had that gave her that beautiful shaky voice. It's way more common than Parkinson's. I've had it for 10 years. It's hand tremors, and it happens when you do an action as opposed to holding my hand up. Things like this. In Photoshop, we do shift-click all the time, and my hands flop everywhere. But when I hold my hand up, not much. And a couple years ago, it went into my head, and my head would constantly shake left and right. And I could not care less as far as my vanity goes. My beautiful girlfriend, Rachel, has never said, I don't want to be with you because of this terrible thing. Rachel's also a nonprofit 501c3, committed to community, director of Heights Arts. I think this is still working. Yeah. So at any rate, I started cutting myself a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago, in the kitchen. I lived by myself, and I was cutting, my hand would jump, and I would cut. And actually, in 1 week's time, I cut myself on the same finger 3 days later, and that's being mindful because I just cut myself before. And then I knew it was time to look into deep brain stimulation, which a neurologist had recommended to me years before, and I wasn't interested at all. The interesting thing is that I have anxiety, and I love my Lexapro, and I love my therapist, and I'm in a really good place. But I just want to tell you that as a caveat, because I had 3 brain surgeries starting a year ago, November. One in November, one in December, second at the end of December, 3 weeks apart, then 2 weeks apart. And then they programmed me. And 4 times I've been programmed. I have transmitters in the thalamus of both of my brains.
You're like
both
a
of
robot.
my brains, my hemispheres.
Multiple brains.
I am like
amazing.
a robot, a cyborg.
Yeah.
But now I turn myself off at night, and I do. I have the app in my pocket, and I turn myself on in the morning when it's time to shave.
Wow.
And all I can tell you is that I had a realization, and I'm feeling it right now, that when I had my tremors, I felt like a mellow guy. You know, I do yoga, and I just felt like me. But after I was turned on the first time, I lock eyes with whatever when I'm shaking, and I don't see things shaking because I lock eyes with it. But with the peripheral vision, on the very far edges, I didn't realize it, but when I was turned on, that all went away, that shaking that I would see on the peripheral. Wow. And so there's kind of this deep, almost like Zen feeling I have that I didn't know I wasn't having. I snorted. It's really beautiful, and I'm so grateful, and I'm so, for people who badmouth our university hospitals and the Cleveland Clinic, which I read about, I hear about, I think we are so lucky, so lucky. People come from all over the world to this amazing city for the gifts. And the director of movement disorders neurology led my team.
Wow, that is so unbelievable. First of all, thank you so much for sharing of your personal story, of your history, of how you got here, of your Jewish upbringing. I brought a text that I wanted to end with, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
You and I talked a lot about kindness, and it really moved me. And I brought you one of my favorite quotes from our tradition, and it's from Talmud, and it says that a student came to Rabbi Hillel and said, I want to convert. What do I have to do? And Hillel says something along the lines of, what is harmful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Mm. And so often, we know do not do what is harmful to your neighbor, right? We know the golden rule, I feel like. But it's the second part that always got to me. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it, right? There's something very active about that. You're not passive. Mm-hmm. You get this kind of headline of understanding that you shouldn't be harmful to others, but that's active. It's not passive. And I think so much of what you have shared with me about your work, and so much of your work is very active. It's not just taking photographs. There's a picture, there's a story, there's a narrative, there's an idea, and there's a message. And in many ways, you are making our world a better place. If anything, not just of sending us a message of kindness, but getting people to think, making people turn their exclamation points into question marks, and not just being comfortable where they are, but being quite uncomfortable. And I think that's a wonderful starting point in creating more kindness in the world. And I'm really grateful that you brought that for us tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you for seeing me that way. I try, and I just can't imagine not having a voice somehow. So grateful. I wanted to say one thing before we wrap, if there aren't questions.
Please.
And that is, like, in my journey learning about things, I didn't know that there was a hierarchy, a division between synagogues historically in who founded the synagogues. And I learned about this through My Promised Land, I think is the book. Incredible book. Yeah. But I learned about how some synagogues are founded Ashkenazi or Sephardic. Mizrahi, I think, is Sephardic. And it's again, this beautiful thing about Tifereth. I know your family story, Yael. And I also know that this is an incredible, historically, an Ashkenazi congregation, including one of the senior rabbis, Rabbi Abba Silver, one of the most famous rabbis in the world. Anyhow, I'm just so in love with the fact that you are the next rabbi here at Tifereth, knowing your Sephardic heritage. And I didn't even know about all this years ago, and I was really sad to read about it. But this was like, no, we're just going to do it. And some people fell in love with you, I think, and we all have since.
Wow, thank you. That's so kind. And this was really a pleasure and a treasure. And I think you've given us all a lot to think about, and lirdof tzedek, to pursue justice with our own voices. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd just like to mention that for anyone interested in seeing it, that Violins, my exhibition's going to Memphis after New York for 3 months, late summer, and then it's going to Pittsburgh for the 5th anniversary of the Tree of Life massacre, and the Violins will be there as well. So since it's driving distance,
and you'll keep us posted on this exhibit as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.